Hello. This thing on. Phew, here goes nothing high. So I got 99 over here. Today we're gonna read Being in Nothingness again. So get ready. Okay, so now we'll be reading Being In for itself. We've been reading been making pretty good progress, if I do say so myself. Like look at how much I've read already. I read all of this on camera. Can you believe it? Anyway. Part 2 being for itself. I know we're already like on page 100 or something like that. Yeah, 120. 120 out of 800 pages. And it's been like 5 days. So basically, if you multiply it by like 7, multiply by 7, it'll be like a month before I finish. It's not too bad. Okay, anyway. Let's get to reading chapter 1, the immediate structures of the for itself. Number 1, or self-presence. Footnote 1. Translators know I translate Sartre's présence à soi as self-presence, rather than the clunkier presence to self. The reader should therefore bear in mind the element of distance between the for itself and itself implied by Sartre's phrase. From negation, we were led to freedom, and from there to bad faith. And bad faith has led us to the being of consciousness as its condition of possibility. We should then resume, in the light of the demands established in the preceding chapters, the description that we began in the introduction to this book. We should return, in other words, the field of the pre-reflexive cogito, but the cogito only ever delivers what we ask it to deliver. Descartes inquired into its functional aspect. I doubt, I think, in wishing to move, without any guiding principle, from there to the dialectic of existence, without any guiding principle. Oops, I reread it. He fell into the error of substantialism. Husserl, learning from this error, stayed timidly at the level of functional description. In so doing, he never advanced. Oh, I'm so tired. Sorry. Don't know why. I woke up at like 10. I woke up at like 12. Now it's 3, so I've only been awake for 3 hours. Locked himself up in the cogito, and he deserves, despite his denials, to be called a phenomenologist. Phenomenalist rather than a phenomenologist. And his phenomenalism constantly comes close to a Kantian idealism. Heidegger wanted to avoid this descriptive phenomenalism, which leads to a Megarian and anti-dialectical isolation of essences. Megarian. Translator note 2, the Megarian school of philosophy was founded in the 4th century BC by Euclides of Megara. Among their doctrines was a rejection of the evidence of the senses, from which Sartre perhaps derives the isolation in essences mentioned in this sentence. Okay. Embarks on the existential analytic directly without going through the cogito. But note 3. Existential analytic is Heidegger's phrase. He claims that the fundamental ontology must begin with an existential analytic of Dasein. Heidegger, 1980, page 4. Okay, hold on. Alright, let me just blow my nose. Didn't know that. Okay, I feel better. But if the scene is stripped from the outset of its dimension of consciousness, we can never win it back. Heidegger endows human reality with a self-understanding defined as an ecstatic project of its own possibilities, or project. And it is no part of our intention to deny this project's existence, but how should we conceive of an understanding that is not in itself conscious of being an understanding? If this ecstatic character of human reality does not arise within the consciousness of ecstasies, it must collapse back into a blind and thing-like in itself. In fact, the cogito has to be our point of departure, but it can be fair to say a parody of a well-known expression that it can lead anywhere, provided that you can get out of it. Footnote 4. Did I even read the... Yeah, I did read the third one. Il mène à toute condition d'en sortir. This phrase was used by the writer and journalist Jules Janin, 1804 to 1874, to characterize journalism. It has been adapted numerous times to French. The sole purpose of our earlier investigations, which focused on the conditions of possibility of various ways of behaving, was to put us in a position where we could inquire the cogito's being and provide us with a dialectical instrument that might enable us to find a means within the cogito itself of escaping from instantaneity in order to approach the totality of being that constitutes human reality. Let us return then to our descriptions of non-thetic consciousness of self. Let us examine its results and ask what it means for consciousness necessarily to be what it is not and not to be what it is. The being of consciousness we wrote in our introduction, is a being for whom in its being there is a question of its being. Footnote 5, Sartre is quoting from his earlier discussions of Heidegger's formula at EN 29. That means the being of consciousness does not coincide with itself in the fullness of adequation. Adequation, which belongs in the in itself, is expressed in this simple formula, being it is what it is. In the in itself, there is not a single particle of being with any distance from itself. In the type of being hereby conceived, there is not the slightest trace of duality. We can express this by saying that in itself has an infinite density of being. It is plenitude. We're able to characterize the principle of identity as synthetic, not only because its scope is limited to a particular region, but above all because it gathers within itself the infinity of density. A is A means A exists in the form of infinite compression. It is an infinite density. Identity is the limiting concept of unification. Footnote 6. The term concept limité is used in French to render the German term Grenzbegriff. In Kantian philosophy, it often means a concept that signals the limits of sense experience. It is usually translated into English either as a boundary concept or as limiting concept, which is why I removed Sartre's hyphen. Hello, Daydreamer. How's it going? I'm just doing some reading today. It is not true that the in itself requires any synthetic unification of its being. At its extreme limit, unity vanishes and passes over into identity. The identity is ideal of the One, and it is through human reality that One enters the world. The in itself is full of itself and impossible to imagine a more complete plenitude. a more perfect adequation of any content to its container. There is not the slightest emptiness in being, not the slightest fissure through which nothingness might slip. Consciousness is characterized, on the contrary, by its decompression of being. Indeed, it is impossible to define it as self-coincident. About this table here, I can say purely and simply that it is this table. But if I'm talking about my belief, I cannot confine myself to saying that it is a belief. My belief is a consciousness of belief. It has often been said that the reflective gaze alters the fact of consciousness on which it is directed. Husserl himself admits that the fact of being seen brings about a complete modification in each erlebnis. We must believe that we have shown the primary condition of any reflexivity is a pre-reflexive cogito. Of course, this cogito does not posit an object. It remains intraconscious. But that does not make it any the less homologous with the reflexive cogito, insofar as it instantiates the basic necessity for unreflected consciousness that it should be seen by itself. From the outset, though, it has this inescapable feature. It exists for a witness, even though this witness for whom consciousness exists is belief. In this way, by virtue solely of the fact that I grasp my belief as a belief, it is no longer anything more than a belief, which makes it no longer a belief. It is a troubled belief. In no case, therefore, can we take the ontological judgment belief as consciousness of belief to be judgment of identity. Oh, I gotta look some stuff up. Intracogito and intraconsciousness. A reflexive cogito. Reflexive. Intraconsciousness. Pre-reflexive cogito. Hold on. Okay, there's someone who got their PhD. No actual entity can be conscious of its own satisfaction, for such knowledge would be a component in the process. Oh man. In being and nothingness, Sartre makes a similar distinction between the cogito pour soi aesthetic consciousness and the pre-reflexive. I don't know what the hell is it talking about. Oh. Okay, whatever. I'll get back to that. Or as I hear, judgment of identity. The subject and attribute are radically different, albeit with the indissoluble unity of the same being. So be it, someone might say. But you are obliged to say at the least that consciousness of belief is consciousness of belief. At this level, we rediscover the in itself. It was simply a matter of choosing the appropriate level at which to grasp our object, but that is not true. To claim that consciousness of belief is consciousness of belief is to dissociate consciousness from its belief, to remove the brackets and to turn belief into an object for consciousness. It involves a sudden leap onto the plane of reflection. If consciousness of belief were only consciousness of belief, it would have to be conscious of itself as being a consciousness of belief. The belief would become merely a transcendent and nomadic feature of consciousness. By confronting this belief, consciousness would be free to determine itself as it pleased. It would resemble the imperturbable gaze which consciousness in Victor Cousin's account casts over psychological phenomena, illuminating each of them in turn. Footnote 7. Sartre is referring to the note of method of psychological observations advocated by the French philosopher Victor Cousin, 1792 to 1867, 6767, as a means to discovering the nature of the consciousness and its elements. By Husserl's analysis of the method of doubt made this fact clear. Only a reflexive consciousness can dissociate itself from what reflected consciousness posits. It is only the reflexive level that something, a bracketing, can be attempted, and that we can refuse to meet Machen, as Husserl puts it. Footnote 8. The Greek term of this sentence is usually transliterated as epoch, epoche. Oh, that's what that word means, epoch, or epoche. See my notes on the section on Husserl vocabulary and notes on the translation. The German verb mitmachen means to participate. The idea here is the reflexive stance moves us out of our everyday participative attitude. Consciousness of belief, even though it irreparably modifies the belief, is not distinct from it. It exists in order to perform the act of faith. We have to acknowledge, therefore, that consciousness of belief is belief. In so doing, we can grasp this twofold structure of referral at its source. Consciousness of belief is belief, and belief is consciousness of belief. In neither case, we can say that consciousness is consciousness or that belief is belief. Each of these terms refers us to the other and passes on over into the other, and yet each term is different from the other. As we have seen, neither belief nor pleasure nor joy can exist before consciousness. Consciousness is the measure of their being. But it is no less true that belief, because it can only exist as troubled, exists from the outset as escaping from itself, as shattering the unity of all the concepts in which we might wish to enclose it. Yeah, I have no idea what this guy's talking about, by the way. Honestly, I'm pretty tired too. Actually, I'm not even tired. It's just me making excuses for not understanding what the guy's talking about. I'm honestly debilitated. Maybe this book is too hard for me to understand. And it's like if you just read meaninglessly, it's like, am I even getting anything out of it? Well, I am learning like big words, but like when am I ever gonna use those words in an argument or a conversation? I guess literally if I just feel like I can use them. Like anyway, I guess I was supposed to mention that I don't really know anything too much about philosophy and I'm kind of a LARP. It's okay. Thus, belief and consciousness of belief are one and the same being, whose characteristic is absolute immanence. But the moment we want to grasp this being, it slips between our fingers and we find ourselves confronted with the outline of a duality, with the play of reflections, because consciousness is a reflection. In fact, insofar as consciousness is a reflection, it is also reflecting. Well, I guess I can figure that out. That's like, your consciousness obviously reflects yourself, and if we attempt to grasp it as reflecting, it disappears. and we find ourselves back with a reflection. Okay, I guess I don't get it then. This reflecting structure has disconcerted those philosophers who have sought to define it by resorting to the infinite, either by positing, as Spinoza does, an idea idea that calls for an idea idea, etc. It's like an idea that references itself. Like I know that I know that I know. I know that I know that I know that I know that I know. I know that 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 I know, and then so on until you die. An infinite recursion loop. Or by defining self-return as Hegel does as the true infinite, but in addition to phrasing and obscuring the phenomenon. The introduction of the infinite into consciousness is no more than an explicative theory whose specific purpose is to reduce consciousness being to that of the in itself. If we accept it as it is given, the objective existence of the reflecting structure obliges us, on the contrary, to conceive a mode of being different from the in itself, not a unity that contains a duality, not a synthesis that surpasses and raises up the abstract moment of thesis and antithesis. Footnote 10. But a duality that is a unity, a reflection of its own reflecting. 11. This is like in Limbus Company when Yi Sang invents the mirror that reflects in a mirror world of himself. This is low-key like a Limbus Company reference. Anyway, let's read footnotes 9, 10, and 11. Did I forget to read footnote 9? Yeah. Footnote 9, Spinoza defines self-consciousness of the idea of an idea in his Ethics, Spinoza 1985. Translator note 10, que de passe et leve les moments abstraits. Sartre refers here to Hegel's concept of sublation. Off Bung. See my note on the passer in the section on Hegel's vocabulary and notes on the translation. Hegel himself points out that the German verb aufbend can mean to raise up. Translator note 11. Unreflect qui est sa propre réflexion. The final word in this French sentence is commonly used to denote reflection as a cognitive activity. This is slightly less clear in the English. Okay. If we try to reach the total phenomenon, that is, the unity of this duality or consciousness of belief, we are referred immediately to one of its terms, and this term refers us to turn to the unitary organization of the immanent. But if, on the contrary, we want to set organization of the immanent, oh my bad. We want to set out from the duality as such and deposit consciousness and belief as a pair. We will arrive at Spinoza's idea idea, and we will miss the pre-reflexive phenomenon that we wanted to investigate. The fact that the pre-reflexive consciousness of itself, or is consciousness of itself, it is this very notion of itself that we need to study. For it defines the very being of consciousness. To begin, we should note that the term in itself, which we have borrowed from tradition to refer to transcendent being, is inaccurate. In fact, at the limit of self-coincidence, the itself vanishes to make way for identical being. The itself cannot be a property of being in itself. It is in its natural reflexive. 12. Okay, hold on. You gotta look up being for itself and being in itself, even though it's like literally at the beginning of the book. I still like don't really know what it means. Okay, and of course I'm gonna go look at Reddit. Okay, a lack of being, a desire for being, being in itself, being or being for itself is by bringing nothingness into the world. Okay, but being in itself is like non-conscious being. I look, you should have never read this book, bro. Yeah, okay. Let's get back to it. I didn't really gain anything. Uh, those like things like reading philosophy or pretending that you're a philosopher versus actually reading philosophy. Fucking boring. LARPing as a philosopher versus reading philosophy. Or was I consciousness of itself? It's the very notion that we have to study. Or actually vanish itself vanishes, making way for identical being, but itself cannot be a property of being in itself. It is in its natural reflexive, as the syntax shows, and in particular the logical rigor of the Latin syntax and the strict distinctions established in grammar between the uses of je and sui. The term itself or himself refers, but it refers precisely to the subject. It points to a relation of the subject with itself, and this relation is precisely a duality, but it is a special kind of duality, since it requires specific verbal symbols, but on the other hand, itself does not designate being, either as a subject or as a complement. Indeed, if I consider the term himself in the phrase, he washes himself, for example, I will observe that it opens up a space that allows the subject himself to appear behind it. It is not the subject, since the subject without a relation to himself would be condensed into the identity of the in itself, but neither is it anything solidly articulated within reality, since it allows the subject to appear behind it. In fact, that this himself cannot be grasped at a real existence. The subject cannot be himself because, as we have seen, where something coincides with itself, that itself disappears. Okay, let's read footnote 12 and 13. Footnote 12. In this context, in which Sartre alludes to linguistic form, reflecti, should be translated as reflective, as in reflexive pronoun. It should be noted. It should be noted the same word in French for reflecti is used for reflected and reflexive. Translator note 13. In this paragraph, I moved from itself to himself. Or Sartre uses the same French term soit for both. See my discussion of pronouns on notes on the translation. In this particular sentence, I have changed Sartre's example to preserve his point. He uses il suni, whose reflexive structure vanishes in English translation. He is bored. Replacing the verb to wash oneself provides the structure Sartre wants. It is not the subject, since the subject without a relation to himself would be condensed into the identity of that in itself. But neither is it solidly articulated within reality, since it allows the subject to appear behind it. In fact, then himself cannot be grasped as a real existence. The subject cannot be himself. As we have seen, we have already, when something coincides with itself, that self disappears, but neither can he not be himself. Oh, I already read that part. Since the himself points to the subject himself, the himself represents, therefore, an ideal distance within the subject's immanence in relation to himself, a way of not being his own coincidence, of escaping from identity, even while positing it as unity. In short, they have a way of constantly unstable equilibrium between identity as a state of absolute cohesion without any trace of diversity, and unity as the synthesis of a multiplicity. We may call this self-presence. The law of being of the for itself as the ontological foundation of consciousness is to be itself in the form of self-presence. Whatever that means, bruh. We're just chatting. Bro wrote a 800-page book just full of bullshit, bro. Bro, just people just get on here and say anything. No, I'm kidding. I'm just frustrated. I don't really know what he's saying, and also because my neck is in a lot of pain. Okay. The self-presence has often been understood as a plenitude of existence, and a widely held prejudice among philosophers attributes to consciousness the highest dignity of being. But in the light of a more thorough description of the notion of presence, this postulate cannot be maintained. In fact, any presence too implies a duality and thus at least a virtual separation. Being's self-presence implies a detachment on the part of being in relation to itself. The coincidence of the identical is the true plenitude of being, precisely because this coincidence leaves no space for any negativity. Doubtless, the principle of identity may call for the principle of non-contradiction, as Hegel saw. The being that the being that is what it is must be able to be the being that is not what it is not. But in the first place, this negation, like all negation, is brought to the surface of being by human reality, as we have all shown, and not through some dialectic that properly belongs to being itself. And further, this principle can only refer to being's relation with exteriority, since precisely it governs being's relation with what it is not. The principle we are considering here, therefore, is constitutive of external relations as they may appear to a human reality present to being in itself and committed within the world. It does not concern being's internal relations. Those relations, insofar as they can be said to posit alterity, do not exist. The principle of identity is the negation of any type of relation with being in itself. On the contrary, self-presence presupposes that an intangible fixed fissure has slipped inside being. If it is present to itself, that is because it is not completely itself. Presence is an immediate degradation of consciousness, because it presupposes separation. But if we now ask what separates the subject from himself, we are forced to admit that it is nothing. Ordinarily, something which separates is a distance in space, an interval in time, a psychological disagreement, or simply the individuality of two co-present terms. In short, it qualifies reality. But in the case we are concerned with here, nothing can separate the consciousness of being from the belief, since the belief is nothing other than the consciousness of belief. The introduction of an external and qualified element from outside the cogito into the unity of a pre-reflexive cogito would break its unity and destroy its translucency. There would be something in consciousness that it was not conscious of, something that did not itself exist as consciousness. The separation that separates belief from itself cannot be grasped or even conceived on its own. If we try to reveal it, it vanishes. We find ourselves back with a belief in the form of pure immanence. Hold on. It's a spine book. They should have made these books like, I don't know. It's like when you make a paperback book and it's too big, like if you open the book too much, the spine's obviously gonna get damaged, which is really annoying. On the contrary, we want to grasp the belief as such. The fissure is there. It appears that we do not want to see it, and as soon as we try to contemplate it, it disappears. This fissure is therefore pure negativity, a distance, an interval of time. A psychological disagreement can be grasped in themselves and as such they contain elements of positivity. It is merely their function that is negative, but the fissure within consciousness is nothing apart from what it negates. And it can have being only insofar as we can see it. This negative, which is both a nothingness of being and a annihilating power, is nothingness. In no other place can we grasp it in such unadulterated form. Everywhere else we are obliged in one way or another to endow it as nothingness with being in itself, but the nothingness that arises in the heart of consciousness is not, it is being. For example, belief, for example, is a thing that is not conscious with another being. It is its own self-presence, its own decompression of being. Otherwise, the unity of the fourth self would collapse into the duality of two in itself. Thus, the for itself must be its own nothingness. The being of consciousness as consciousness is to exist at a distance from itself. A self-presence, and this non-zero distance that being bears within its being is nothingness. Thus, in order for an itself to exist, the unity of this being must involve its own nothingness as annihilation of the identical. For the nothingness that slides into belief is its nothingness, the nothingness of belief as itself belief, as blind and full belief as simple faith. The for itself is the being that determines itself to exist, insofar as it is able to coincide with itself. Footnote 14. Comme foi du charbonnier. Such are uses that idiomatic expression again. Simple faith, as in, like, the coal man's faith, which is, they just believe that good things will happen to them or some shit. We are able to understand that our inquiry without any guiding principle into the pre-reflexive cogito has not led us to find nothingness anywhere. We cannot find or disclose nothingness in the way we can find or disclose a being. Nothingness is always an elsewhere. It is the for itself's obligation to never exist in the form of an elsewhere in relation to itself. To exist as a being that is constantly qualified by its own inconsistency in being. This inconsistency, moreover, does not involve another being. It is only a constant referral from itself to itself, from the reflections to the reflecting, from the reflecting to the reflection. Nevertheless, this referral does not give rise to an infinite momentum within the for itself, but is given in the unity of a single act. The infinite movements appears only to the standpoint of reflection, which aims to grasp the phenomenon as a totality, and which is referred from the reflection to the reflecting, from the reflecting to the reflection without being able to stop. Thus nothingness in this whole in being, the sliding of the in itself towards the itself, through which the for itself constitutes itself, but this nothingness can be been only if its borrowed existence is correlative to a annihilating act of being, We may call this continual act through which the in itself is degraded into self-presence, the ontological act. Nothingness is the putting into question of being by being. That precisely is consciousness or the for itself. It is an absolute event that is brought to being through being, and which, without having any being, is constantly maintained by being, since being in itself is isolated within its being by complete positivity. No being can produce being, and nothing can happen to being through being other than nothingness. Nothingness is being's distinctive possibility and its unique possibility. Even so, this original possibility can appear only in the act of its actualization. As nothingness is the nothingness of being, it can only arrive within being through being itself. And of course, it arrives in being through a particular being, which is human reality. For this being is constituted as human reality insofar as it is nothing but the original project of its own nothingness. Human reality instantiates being insofar as it is, in its being and for being, the unique foundation of the nothingness at the heart of being. Yeah, okay. Whatever that means. And let me check how much it is to get to the next chapter. It's only a few pages. Okay. I mean, usually I read for 2 hours anyway, but hold on. You mind if I go and get some water? I'm thirsty. Reading. Okay, to the for itself facticity. However, the for itself it is, as some may say, even if its way of being is such that it is not what it is, and it is what it is not. It is, because the project of sincerity, whatever stumbling blocks that I may run up against can at least be conceived. It is as an event, in the sense which I can say that Felipe II, the second, or that my friend Pierre is and exists. It is insofar as it appears in a condition that it is not chosen, insofar as Pierre is a French bourgeois in 1942, insofar as Schmidt was a worker in Berlin in 1870. It is, insofar as it is thrown into the world. For this wall, this tree, this cup, the basic question, why is this being such and not otherwise? I don't fucking know. It is insofar as in it is insofar as in it there is something of which it is not the foundation, its presence to the world. Being's apprehension of itself as not being its own foundation lies within every cogito. In this respect, we should note that it is immediately encountered by Descartes' reflexive cogito. Indeed, when Descartes wants to put his discovery to good use, he apprehends himself as an imperfect being, since he doubts, but within this imperfect being, he notes the presence of the idea of perfection. He recognizes, therefore, a disparity between the type of being he is able to conceive and the being that he is. This disparity or lack of being lies at the origin of the second proof of God's existence. Indeed, if we said, let's go footnote 15. Sartre is referring here to the second proof offered by Descartes in his Principles, Descartes, 1983. Indeed, if we set aside its scholastic terminology, what remains of this proof is a very clear sense that the being which possesses within it is the idea that perfection cannot be its own foundation. Otherwise, it would have designed itself in conformity with that idea. In other words, a being that was its own foundation that would not tolerate the slightest mismatch between what it is and what it conceives, for it would build itself in conformity with its understanding of being and would be able to conceive only of what it is. Instead, this apprehension of being as a lack of being in the face of being is, from the outside, the cogito's grasp of its own contingency. I think, therefore I am. Classic. What am I? A being who is not his own foundation and who, insofar as he is a being, might be other than he is to the extent to which he does not explain his being. This is the primary intuition of our own contingency, cited by Heidegger as the primary motivation for our transition from inauthenticity to authenticity. It is uneasiness, the call of conscious, Ruf Degewissens, the feeling of guilt. Okay, let's go footnote 16. As Heidegger, can you guys read that? Whatever, I'll read it to you. As Heidegger discusses the Ruf Degewissens at Heidegger 1980, page 54, is usually translated as the call of consciousness. The feeling of guilt. In fact, Heidegger's description is overly influenced by his concern to provide an ontological foundation for an ethics in which he claims to take no interest, and to reconcile his humanism with the religious meaning of the transcendent. The intuition of our contingency should not be equated with a feeling of guilt. We have to appear to ourselves with the character of an unjustifiable fact. But we have just now understood ourselves in terms of consciousness, that is, as a being that exists through itself. Okay, 17. Sartre's note CF earlier in the work, introduction to section 3, the capo 3, Marisol. How are we able to be within the unity of a single arising into being, this being that exists through itself, as not being the foundation of its being? Or to put it in other terms, how can the for itself, which insofar as it is not its own being, in the sense that it might be its own foundation, be the foundation insofar as it is for itself of its own nothingness? The answer lies in the question, if indeed being, as the annihilation of its own being, is the foundation of nothingness, that does not amount to saying that it is the foundation of its being. In order for something to be found its own being, it must exist at a distance from itself. That implies the specific annihilation of both the founded being and the founding being, and a duality that is a unity. We are back with the case of the for itself. In brief, any endeavor to conceive the idea of a being that is the foundation of its being leads us, in spite of itself, to form the idea of a being that, contingent insofar as it is being in itself, is the foundation of its own nothingness. The act of causation through which God is causa sui is, like any reclamation by something of itself, annihilating act to the precise extent to which the most basic relation is necessarily a return to itself, a reflexivity. And this original necessity in turn appears on the foundation of a contingent being, the precise being which is in order to be its own cause. As for Leibniz's attempt to define the necessary on the basis of the possible, a definition that Kant took up, it is conceived from the point of view of knowledge, not from the point of view of being. As Leibniz conceives it, the movement from possibility to being A necessary being is one whose possibility implies its existence, registers the movement from our ignorance to knowledge. Indeed, the possibility here can only be a possibility with respect to our thought. Since it precedes existence, it is an external possibility in relation to the being whose possibility it is, since being follows from it in the way a consequence follows from a principle. But as we showed earlier, we can consider the notion of possibility under its two aspects. We can, in effect, turn it into a subjective index. The index. It is possible that Pierre is dead. It is possible that Pierre is dead means I do not know Pierre's fate. And in the case, it will be the witness in the presence of the world who determines what is possible. Being's possibility lies outside it, in the pure act of looking that weighs up its chances of being. Possibilities may indeed be given to us before being, but it is given to us, and it is not the possibility of this being. If the marble rolling across the rug is diverted by a fold in the material, there is no part of the marble's possibility, and neither does the possibility of diversion belong to the rug. It can only be synthetically established by a witness as an external relationship. A possibility may appear to us as an ontological structure of reality. In that case, it belongs to some being as their possibility, that it is the possibility that they are, a possibility that they have to be. In this case, being maintains its own possibility in their being. It is their foundation, and being's necessity cannot therefore be derived from its possibility. In brief, God, if he exists, is contingent. Thus, the being of consciousness, insofar as this being is itself in order to annihilate itself into the for itself, remains contingent. That is, consciousness does not have any capacity to give its being to itself, or to receive it from others. And furthermore, as the ontological proof, like the cosmological proof, fails to constitute any necessary being, we cannot seek the explanation and the foundation of my being, insofar as I am a being like this. In necessary being, the premises, anything contingent must be founded in a necessary being. Now I am contingent, shows a desire for foundation, but not any explanatory connection to a real foundation. The fact they could account not for this contingency here at all, but only for the abstract idea of contingency in general, and furthermore, they are concerned with value, not with fact. Footnote 18. Sauter's note. Indeed, this piece of reasoning, you can't even read that. Oh, whatever. Indeed, this piece of reasoning is based explicitly on the requirements of reason. But if by being in itself is contingent, it becomes degraded into the for itself by taking itself up. It is, in order to lose itself in the for itself. In brief, being is and can only be. But then possibility that properly belongs to being, and which is revealed in the act of annihilation, is to be the foundation of itself as consciousness through the sacrificial act that annihilates it. The for itself in the in itself losing itself as in itself to found itself as consciousness. How many times are you going to say itself, consciousness, and being, bruh? Like, that's crazy. Thus consciousness owes its being consciousness to itself, and it can implicate only itself insofar as it is its own annihilation. But that which annihilates itself to become consciousness, which cannot be described as the foundation of consciousness, is the contingent in itself. The in itself cannot found anything. If it founds itself, that is by modifying itself to become the for itself. It is its own foundation insofar as it already no longer in itself. Hold on. 2 more pages. And here we encounter the origin of every foundation. If the being in itself can neither be its own foundation nor the foundation of other things, foundation in general enters into the world through the for itself. The for itself does not only as annihilated in itself found itself, but along the for itself foundation appears for the first time. Still, this in itself, swallowed up, annihilated by the absolute event, is the appearing of foundation, or the for itself's arising, remains at the heart of the for itself and as its original contingency. Consciousness is its own foundation, but it remains contingent that there is consciousness rather than the pure and simple in itself, extending to infinity. The absolute event or the for itself is contingent in its very being. If I articulate what is given in the pre-reflexive cogito, I will observe, of course, that the for itself refers to itself. Whatever it is in the mode of consciousness of being. Thirst refers to the consciousness of thirst that it is, as if it were in its foundation, and conversely, but it can be given the reflecting reflected. The reflected reflecting totality would be contingent and in itself. But I can never reach this totality, since I can say neither my consciousness or thirst of consciousness of thirst, nor that my thirst is thirst. The totality is there as annihilated totality, as the phenomenon's evanescent unity. If I grasp the phenomenon as a plurality, this plurality will indicate itself as a totalizing unity and will thereby have the meaning of contingency. So I can ask, but why am I thirsty? Why am I conscious of that glass, or conscious of this self? But as soon as I consider this totality in itself, it annihilates itself before my eyes. It is not, it is in order to be, and I am returned to the for itself of apprehending as it sketches out its duality and the foundation of itself. I'm angry because I produce myself as a consciousness of this anger. Remove this self-causation, constitutive of the for itself being, and you will cease to encounter anything. Not even anger in itself, because it is in the nature of anger to exist as for itself. Unless the for itself is supported by a constant contingency it takes up and assimilates without ever being able to get rid of it. We may call this constantly evanescent contingency of the in itself, which haunts the for itself and ties it to being in itself without ever allowing itself to be grasped. The for itself's facticity, this facticity enables us to say that the for itself is, that it exists, and even though we... Oh shit, I almost broke my book. Even though we can never actualize our facticity and we always apprehend it through the for itself, we pointed it out earlier that we can never be anything without playing at being it. If I'm the cafe waiter, we wrote, it can only be in the mode of not being him. Okay, let's read footnote 19. Sutter's note, part 1, chapter 2, section 2, forms of bad faith. Okay, so they're just referencing the thing. And that is true. If I were able to be a cafe waiter, I would constitute myself all at once as a contingent mass of identity. That is not how it is. That kind of being, contingent and in itself, will always escape me. But in order for me to freely bestow a meaning on the obligations attached to my conditions, it must be the case that within the for itself as a perpetually evanescent totality, being in itself as the evanescent contingency of my situation is in some sense given. This becomes clear if we reflect on the fact that although I have to play at being a cafe waiter in order to be one, it is also true that however hard I try to play at being a diplomat or a sailor, I will not be one. This inapprehensible fact of my condition, this intangible difference that sets apart the play acting that actualized something from play acting to court, explains why the for itself, even while it chooses the meaning of its situation and constitutes itself in situations, as its own foundation does not choose its position. It is the reason why I apprehend myself as being wholly responsible for my being, insofar as I am its foundations, and at the same time wholly unjustifiable. Without facticity, consciousness would be able to choose its attachments in the world, in the manner in which souls in the Republic can choose their condition. I could decide to be born working class or born bourgeois. Bourgeois. But on the other hand, my facticity cannot constitute me as being bourgeois or as being working class. I wish I could just choose to be rich. Strictly speaking, my facticity is not even the resistance of facts, since it is by taking up within it the infrastructure of my pre-reflexive cookie till I endow it with its meaning and resistance. My facticity is only an indication that I present to myself of the being I am obliged to keep company with. In order to be what I am, it is impossible to grasp it in its brute nakedness, because we only encounter it when we have already reclaimed and freely constructed it. The mere fact of being there, at this table, in this room, is already the pure object of a limiting concept, and we can only make contact with it as such, and yet my consciousness of being there contains it as its full contingency, as the annihilated in itself against whose ground and the for itself produces itself as a consciousness of being there, and sounding the depths of its own consciousness of being there. The for itself can discover in itself nothing but its motivation, which means it will be constantly referred back to itself and to its constant freedom. I am there in order to, etc. But the contingency that permeates these motivations, and just to the extent in which they entirely found themselves, is the for itself's facticity. Hold on, can I take a minute? I kind of want to download Resident Evil Biohazard and play that today. Now look, you don't have too many ideas on what to play. I mean, actually, I do. I have like a ton of games, but I just don't know what to play. There's this game called Firewatch. Is this even a good game? Why do I even have the game downloaded? Well, I do know why. Okay, sorry, I'm taking up too much time, huh? LMNOP. Or maybe I'll just play Biohazard. I mean Village. Or Project Zomboid. No, I already have everything downloaded. Oh shit. Wait, hold on. Okay, I'm good. Now, where was I? For itself can discover in itself nothing but its motivations, which means it will constantly be referred back to itself and its constant freedom. I'm here in order to, etc. But the contingency there permeates these motivations, and just to the extent to which they entirely found themselves is the for itself's facticity. The relation between the for itself, which is for itself in its own foundations, and facticity can correctly be denominated a factual necessity, and Descartes and Husserl grasped that factual necessity precisely as the source of the cogito's evidence. The for itself is necessary insofar as it founds itself, and that is why it can be reflected object of an apodictic intuition. I cannot doubt that I am, but it is possible that this for itself as such could not be, and has the contingency of a fact. Just as my annihilating freedom apprehends itself through anguish, so the for itself is conscious of its facticity. It feels itself to be entirely gratuitous. It apprehends itself as being there for nothing, as being de trop. We must not confuse facticity with that Cartesian substance whose attribute is thinking. Of course, that thinking substance exists only insofar as it thinks, and as a created thing, it shares in the contingency of the ins creatum. But it retains the character of in itself in its entirety, even though the for itself in its attribute there has been described as Descartes' substantialist illusion. For us, on the contrary, the appearance of the for itself or the absolute event is a sign of an in itself's endeavor to be found itself. It corresponds to an attempt on the part of being to remove contingency from its being, but this attempt leads to the in itself's annihilation, because the in itself cannot found itself without introducing the itself, a reflexive annihilating referral, into the absolute identity of its being, and without in consequence becoming degraded into for itself. The for itself corresponds therefore to a destruction and decompression of the in itself, and the in itself annihilates itself and absorbs itself in its attempt to found itself. The in itself is not there for a substance of which the for itself is an attribute, a substance able to produce thought without being exhausted in the very act of production. It merely remains within the for itself like a memory of being, as this unjustifiable presence to the world. Being in itself can be found its nothingness, but not for a being. In its movement of decompression, it annihilates itself into a for itself that, as for itself, becomes its own foundation. But its in itself contingency remains untouched, and it is what the in itself as facticity within the for itself, and it is the reason why the for itself has only a factual necessity, why the for itself is the foundation of its consciousness, being, or existence, but cannot ever found its presence. In this way, consciousness cannot ever prevent itself from being, and yet it is completely responsible for its being. Okay, fucking whatever, bro. I wish I knew what this guy was talking about. Is this gonna be like the long part? How many pages is this? Myself and the Circuit of Ipsity. Note 3, I missed 4. There's 4 at 150, so that's in 13 pages. Man, I don't even want to read this shit no more, bruh. What should I do? Should I go to bed? Well, I think I should end the video for 1. Then I can just scroll on TikTok all day. Okay, fuck it, video's over. Thanks for watching. I'm gonna go to bed now. I'm not gonna go to bed. I'm gonna play Resident Evil or something, or play another game, or kill myself. Okay, good night.